I never thought I'd be the guy posting here, but life has a twisted sense of humor. My name's Jake, I'm 34, and I work as a project manager in a tech company. My life was stable, good job, a house in the suburbs, and what I thought was a solid marriage. I met my wife, Emily, 9 years ago through mutual friends, and we hit it off instantly. She was charming, outgoing, and had a way of making every moment feel like an adventure. We dated for 3 years before getting married, and at the time, I was convinced I had hit the jackpot. Emily worked in marketing and had always been social, but I never minded. I liked that about her. She was the type who could walk into a room full of strangers and leave with a dozen new friends. I trusted her completely, but looking back, maybe I was just blind. Things started changing about 6 months ago. At first, it was subtle small shifts in behavior, little things that didn't seem worth worrying about on their own. She started dressing up more, wearing perfume even when she was just meeting a friend for lunch. She became glued to her phone, smiling at messages she wouldn't let me see. And the biggest red flag? She started picking fights over nothing. 1 minute, we'd be fine, and the next, she'd snap at me for something ridiculous, leaving a dish in the sink, asking about her plans, or just existing in her space. It was like she wanted a reason to be mad at me. At the time, I chalked it up to stress, but deep down, something felt off. The breaking point came when she started spending an unusual amount of time at a particular restaurant downtown. She claimed she loved the atmosphere and that it had the best cocktails. I didn't think much of it at first, but then I started noticing patterns. She would go there constantly, sometimes alone, sometimes with her friends, but always on the nights I worked late. And every time I asked about it, she'd get defensive. Too defensive. 1 night, something told me to check her bank statements, and that's when my world started unraveling. That night, I sat on the couch with my laptop, staring at Emily's bank statements. I had never been the type to check up on her like this. We had always had a pretty open relationship when it came to finances. I knew what she made, she knew what I made, and we split expenses fairly. But something in my gut told me I wouldn't like what I found, and I was right. There it was, multiple charges at the same restaurant. And I'm not talking about casual dinner dates with friends. Some of these bills were outrageous. $150. $200. $250. Who spends that much on dinner alone? And why was she going there so often? At first, I told myself maybe she was just treating her friends. Maybe she liked the place so much that she didn't care about the cost. But then I noticed the timing. Every time I had a late shift or a work trip, she had been there. I scrolled further and saw that it had been happening for months. The charges were consistent, sometimes once or twice a week, sometimes more, and then I saw the final nail in the coffin. A hotel charge, not a big one, just a single night stay at a boutique hotel a few blocks from that restaurant. But that was all I needed to see. I sat there, my heart pounding, my hands gripping the laptop so tightly I thought I might snap it in half. I felt like an idiot. How had I not seen this sooner? I closed my laptop and just sat there, staring at nothing. For a moment, I thought about confronting her right away. But something inside me stopped me. No. I needed to be sure. I needed undeniable proof. So, I did what any man in my position would do. I started planning. I was going to catch her in the act. The next day, I casually asked her what she was doing that weekend. She barely even looked up from her phone when she answered, going to brunch with the girls, then probably stopping by that restaurant after. You know how much I love their cocktails. I forced a smile and nodded. Yeah, I know. That night, while she was in the shower, I took her phone from the nightstand. Locked, of course. But I knew her password. She always used the same one. My hands were shaking as I unlocked it and went straight to her messages, and there it was. A conversation with someone named Nate. I didn't recognize the number, but it didn't matter. The messages told me everything I needed to know. Can't wait to see you this weekend. Same time? Of course, babe. I'll meet you after brunch. Missed you this week. You looked amazing last time. Huh, well maybe next time you can keep your hands to yourself until we leave the restaurant. I felt my stomach drop. Babe? Hands to himself, I kept scrolling, reading message after message, each one worse than the last. Flirty, suggestive, full of inside jokes and references to nights spent together, and then I saw the worst part, that a photo of them together, taken at that very restaurant. It wasn't just some casual picture. She was leaning into him, her hand on his chest, his arm wrapped around her waist. I turned off the phone and set it back down exactly where I found it. I had enough. I wasn't going to argue with her. I wasn't going to scream that I was going to catch her, and when I did, there would be no way for her to talk her way out of it. This weekend was going to change everything. I spent the next couple of days pretending everything was fine, acting like the clueless husband she thought I was. It wasn't easy, but I knew I had to play this right. If I tipped her off, she'd change her plans, and I wouldn't get the proof I needed. She still smiled at me like nothing was wrong, still kissed me goodbye in the mornings, still acted like she was the loving wife she always claimed to be. But now, every time she touched me, every time she spoke, I felt disgusted. I wanted to throw everything in her face right then and there, but I held back because I needed to see it with my own eyes. Saturday came, and she got ready for her brunch with the girls. She took her time, putting on makeup, fixing her hair, choosing the perfect outfit. I watched her from the doorway, arms crossed, pretending to be interested in something on my phone. She was humming to herself, completely unaware that I knew everything. She kissed me on the cheek, said she'd be back later, and walked out the door. I waited exactly 10 minutes before grabbing my keys and following her. She wasn't going to brunch. I tailed her downtown, keeping my distance, my heart pounding the entire time. I didn't even know what I was expecting to feel when I saw it happen. Anger? Relief? A part of me still hoped that somehow, I was wrong. That maybe there was an explanation, some kind of mistake. But deep down, I knew better. She parked a couple of blocks away from the restaurant and walked inside. I found a spot nearby, my hands gripping the steering wheel as I watched from a distance. She wasn't waiting for any girlfriends. A few minutes later, he walked in, tall, dark hair, dressed well but casually. A waiter. The same one from the photo. I watched as they greeted each other like a couple who had done this 100 times before. She reached for his hand, and he leaned in, whispering something in her ear that made her laugh. I felt my jaw clench, my vision narrowing as I watched them slide into a booth together, completely comfortable, completely at ease. I could have stormed in right then. I could have made a scene, humiliated her in front of everyone. But I wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. She would have expected rage. She would have expected chaos. But what she wouldn't expect was cold, calculated revenge. I snapped a few photos from my car, then got out and walked toward the restaurant. I kept my head down, pulled up the hood of my jacket, and slipped inside without them noticing. I found a seat at the bar, just close enough to hear bits and pieces of their conversation. She was complaining about me. Me. The man she vowed to love and be faithful to. She was laughing about how I never noticed anything, how she felt so alive with this guy. I clenched my fists under the bar, keeping myself in check. Not yet. Then, I heard him ask her something that made my blood run cold. So, when are you finally leaving him? She hesitated. Soon, she said, stirring her drink. I just need to figure things out. He still trusts me, so I have time. Time for what? To keep sneaking around? To drain our savings? To use me as a safety net until she was ready to run off with this guy. That was it. I stood up, walked over to their booth, and slid into the seat right next to her. She gasped, her face going pale as she realized who had just joined them. The waiter's eyes widened, his confidence evaporating in an instant. I set my phone on the table, screen facing up, displaying every single photo, every text, every piece of proof I had gathered. Don't stop on my account, I said, my voice calm, eerily steady. I'd love to hear more about how you feel so alive sneaking around behind my back. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She was caught. There was no lie big enough to get her out of this one. The waiter looked like he wanted to disappear. I turned to him, my eyes locking onto his. "So, Nate," I said, deliberately saying his name. "You were just asking when she was leaving me, right? Well, here's your answer." I pulled out divorce papers. "Already signed. Already prepared," her face twisted in shock. "You how?" "I've known for weeks," I cut her off. "I let you play your little game. I let you lie. I let you think I was too stupid to notice. But you know what the best part is? I don't even care anymore." Her eyes filled with panic. "Jake, wait, no," I said, my voice final. "You don't get to talk. You don't get to explain. You made your choice, and now you get to live with it." I turned to the waiter, who was practically sweating at this point. "She's all yours, Nate. Good luck. You'll need it." I stood up, slid the papers toward her, and walked out without looking back. As I stepped outside, the weight that had been crushing me for months suddenly lifted. I was free. Free of her lies, free of the betrayal, free of a woman who never deserved me in the first place, and as I walked away, I didn't feel sad that I felt relieved. Walking out of that restaurant was the most freeing moment of my life. For weeks, I had been drowning in suspicion, anger, and betrayal, but now, with the truth out in the open, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: clarity. Emily had spent months lying to me, sneaking around behind my back, treating me like a fool while she built her little fantasy with that waiter. But the thing that hit me the hardest wasn't even the affair itself, it was the way she spoke about me when she thought I wasn't listening. The way she reduced our years together to nothing more than an inconvenience, something she needed to figure out before moving on. As I drove home, my hands tightened around the steering wheel, not out of anger, but out of resolve. I had wasted enough time being hurt, wondering where I went wrong, questioning if there was something I could have done differently. But now? I was done with all of that. There was nothing left to save. No marriage, no trust, no love. Just a woman who had taken everything I gave her and treated it like it was disposable. By the time I got home, I already knew my next steps. I had prepared for this. While she had been busy sneaking around, I had been busy protecting myself. The divorce papers were already signed. The only thing left was for her to accept them. I went inside, grabbed a suitcase, and started packing my things. Not because I was leaving, but because I wanted to be the first one to move forward. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of begging for answers or closure. I wanted her to come home to an empty space, to see for herself that I had already moved on. The more I packed, the lighter I felt. I wasn't just taking clothes or personal belongings, I was taking back my dignity, my self-respect, my freedom. Emily had no idea what was coming. I had already spoken to a lawyer weeks ago when my suspicions first started. I had copies of everything: the bank statements, the hotel charges, the messages. I wasn't going to get caught up in some emotional argument where she twisted the blame or tried to justify her actions. This was purely business. Now that I left the papers on the kitchen counter, right next to the ring she clearly hadn't valued enough to stay faithful. And then, I walked out. I didn't need to wait for her to come home. She wasn't my problem anymore. That night, I checked into a hotel, turned off my phone, and for the first time in a long time, I actually slept peacefully. No more wondering where she was, no more stressing over her lies, no more feeling like I was losing control of my own life. The next morning, I woke up early, checked my phone, and saw the messages: a dozen missed calls, texts filled with confusion, panic, and desperation. Emily had come home to an empty house and divorce papers waiting for her. She finally realized what I had known for weeks: this was over. That morning, I ignored every single call and text from Emily. I could almost hear her voice in my head, scrambling to explain herself, trying to find an excuse that would make me pause. But there was nothing she could say that would undo what she had done. I wasn't interested in hearing her sob stories, her excuses, or whatever pathetic attempt at damage control she had planned. She had her chance. She made her choice. Now, she had to live with it that I got out of bed, took a long shower, and looked at myself in the mirror. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel weighed down by doubt or frustration. There was no voice in my head whispering that maybe I was overreacting, that maybe there was a way to fix this. There was nothing left to fix. The only thing I needed to do now was cut the final ties and move forward. By noon, I decided to go back to the house. Not because I wanted to see Emily, I didn't. But because I knew she was going to be there, waiting, desperate to talk, and I wanted to get it over with. I wasn't going to hide. I wasn't going to drag this out with endless back-and-forth arguments. I was going to face her, say what needed to be said, and leave for good. When I pulled into the driveway, I could already see her pacing through the living room window. She must have been waiting there for hours. The moment I stepped inside, she spun around, her face a mess of emotions, shock, anger, panic. She had been crying, but I didn't care. Her tears didn't mean anything to me anymore. She had made me feel small for months. Now, it was her turn to feel powerless. The second I closed the door, she started. Rapid-fire excuses. Half-truths. A desperate attempt to make it all go away. She swore she was going to tell me that she just needed time to figure things out. That it wasn't serious, that it didn't mean anything. She said it was just a mistake, that she had gotten caught up in something she didn't intend for, that she never stopped loving me. But as I stood there, watching her grasp at anything that might save her, I realized how empty her words were. She wasn't sorry she had done it. She was sorry she got caught, and when she saw that I wasn't reacting, that I wasn't giving her the emotional response she wanted, she turned defensive. She started blaming me. She said I had been distant. That I worked too much. That she felt neglected, and Nate, her precious waiter, had just been there for her, in ways that I wasn't. It was so predictable, so cliché, that I almost laughed. Instead, I just shook my head and let her talk. Because I had already won, she didn't understand that there was no saving this. That I wasn't here to argue or fight or beg for an explanation. I was here to end it. That I told her I had already spoken to a lawyer. That the papers were already drawn up and she just needed to sign them. She was shocked at how quickly I had moved, as if she had expected me to crumble, to cry, to plead with her to stay. But I didn't. Because I had seen the truth, and the truth was, I didn't love her anymore. That I had spent months doubting myself, wondering if I was just being paranoid, if I was the problem. But now? Now, I felt nothing. That I told her I was leaving for good, that she could pack her things and figure out where to go next. That I wouldn't be staying here anymore, and neither would she. This house wasn't ours anymore. It was just another empty space, just like our marriage had become. She begged. She cried. She tried to guilt me into staying, into forgiving her. But the more she spoke, the more I realized that this was exactly what I needed. Seeing her like this, desperate, helpless, was all the closure I required. She wasn't the strong, confident woman I had fallen in love with. She was a liar, a cheater, and a coward, and so, I walked away. That I didn't slam the door. I didn't look back. I didn't give her the satisfaction of seeing me break, because I wasn't broken. She was, and for the first time in months, I was finally free. Driving away from that house, I felt a strange numbness creeping in. Not sadness, not anger, just a heavy, hollow emptiness. It was like my body was finally catching up with everything my mind had already processed. Emily was no longer my wife. She might still legally hold that title for a little while longer, but in every way that mattered, she was already gone. For months, I had fought against my instincts, ignored the red flags, convinced myself that the distance between us was temporary, just another rough patch. I had been a fool. While I was busy trying to hold everything together, she was already letting go, one piece at a time. The late nights, the secrecy, the way she picked fights over nothing, it had all been leading up to this moment. And the worst part? She hadn't even respected me enough to be honest about it. As I drove aimlessly through the city, I kept replaying everything in my head. All the little lies. All the time she looked me in the eye and told me she loved me while she was sneaking around with someone else. The text messages I had read, the way she laughed about me with him, as if I were some clueless idiot, an obstacle she just hadn't figured out how to remove yet, that I had wasted years of my life on a woman who never saw me as enough. The thought made my grip on the steering wheel tighten. I had been her husband. The man who stood by her, supported her, built a life with her. And in return, she had treated me like a placeholder, something to keep her occupied until she found something more exciting. Pulling into a gas station, I shut off the engine and just sat there for a while, staring at the blinking neon sign in the window. I wasn't sad anymore. I wasn't even furious. I was just exhausted. Exhausted from caring so much about someone who never really cared about me. I checked my phone out of habit, expecting more missed calls and texts, but for the first time since leaving the house, there was nothing. She had stopped trying to reach me. That realization hit me harder than I expected. Maybe she had finally understood that there was nothing left to say. Maybe she was sitting alone in that house, staring at the divorce papers, realizing just how thoroughly she had ruined everything. Or maybe she was already back with Nate, her little escape plan, whispering lies into his ear just like she had done with me. Maybe she had never really cared if I stayed or left. Maybe she had just been biding her time, waiting for the right moment to get rid of me. I shook my head, trying to force the thoughts away. None of it mattered anymore. I wasn't her problem, and she wasn't mine. She could live whatever life she wanted, and I would do the same. I got out of the car and went inside the gas station, grabbing a bottle of water and a pack of gum just to have something to do. The cashier barely looked up as he rang me up, and for some reason, that small moment of normalcy hit me hard. The world was still moving. My life wasn't over just because my marriage was. This wasn't the end, it was just a new beginning. When I got back in the car, I made a decision. No more sitting around. No more grieving over a woman who never deserved me. I had spent enough time letting her betrayal control my emotions, enough time replaying the past, searching for answers that no longer mattered. She had made her choices. Now it was time for me to make mine. I pulled out my phone and deleted her number. I unfollowed her on everything. I erased every trace of her from my life in a matter of minutes. If she wanted to reach me, she couldn't. She had lost that privilege. Then, I did something I never thought I would do. I called a friend I hadn't spoken to in years. Back when Emily and I first got married, I had been close with a group of guys from work. We used to go out, travel, make plans. But as time went on, she slowly pulled me away from them. Always saying I was spending too much time out, that I should be at home, that a married man didn't need to be going on weekend trips with his friends. And like an idiot, I listened. I prioritized her over everything else. And where had that gotten me? The phone rang twice before he picked up. His voice was surprised but warm. It had been a long time. We talked for a while, catching up, and before I knew it, I was making plans to meet up with him and some of the old crew. They had all moved on with their lives, started businesses, traveled, done things I had put on hold for a marriage that was now nothing more than a joke. As I ended the call, I felt something strange excitement. For the first time in months, maybe even years, I wasn't thinking about Emily. I was thinking about myself, and it felt damn good. The next morning, I woke up feeling lighter. Not happy, not completely at peace, but free. There were still pieces of my old life lingering around me, but for the first time, they didn't feel like chains. They felt like remnants of something I was finally ready to leave behind. Emily hadn't tried to contact me again. No more calls, no more texts. Maybe she had finally accepted it, or maybe she was just too busy with him. Either way, I didn't care. The thought of her used to consume me, used to fill my chest with rage and betrayal. But now? She was just someone I used to know. I packed up my things from the hotel and headed back into the city. I had already decided I wasn't going to mope around in some rented room, drowning in self-pity. I wasn't the victim in this story. I was the one walking away. That afternoon, I met up with the guys. It had been years since we all sat at the same table, years since I allowed myself to have friendships outside of my marriage. And as soon as I saw them, I realized how much I had given up for Emily. They had lived, traveled, started new careers. They had experiences that I had missed out on because I was too busy trying to build a future with someone who had never been fully committed to me. They never judged me for disappearing, never held it against me. But they could see it in my face. Something in me had changed. That we talked, laughed, caught up on lost time, and for the first time in forever, I didn't feel broken. I wasn't just the guy whose wife cheated on him. I was still me. A man with a life ahead of him, a future that no longer involved her. Later that night, I checked my phone, not because I was waiting for Emily to reach out, but because I was ready to block her for good. I opened her messages one last time, scanning over the desperate apologies, the weak justifications, the pathetic attempts to rewrite the past, and then I deleted everything: her number, her messages, our photos, all of it. She had been a chapter in my life, but I was done reading it. That I went to bed that night with a strange sense of clarity. I had lost something, yes. But I had also gained something bigger: myself, and that was worth more than anything she had taken from me. The next morning, I woke up, and for the first time in months, I didn't think about her. I didn't wake up with that crushing weight on my chest, that sick feeling in my stomach. There was no urge to check my phone for another one of her desperate texts, no moment of weakness where I wanted to hear her voice just to see if she'd finally tell the truth. She was gone. And I had never felt stronger. That I got out of bed, took a deep breath, and made a decision. It was time to take my life back. For too long, I had been living in the wreckage of our marriage, trying to figure out where it all went wrong. But now, I realized I didn't need to understand it. I didn't need to sit there analyzing every little moment, every sign I had ignored. She had made her choices, and I had made mine. She chose to betray me. I chose to move on. So, I started rebuilding. The first thing I did was get out of that damn hotel. I found a new apartment, my own space. No shared memories, no ghosts of our relationship haunting the corners. Just me, starting fresh. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was mine, and that was all that mattered. That I focused on work, threw myself into projects I had neglected, started making moves that I had put on hold because of her. I wasn't holding myself back anymore. I wasn't waiting for an apology that would never come, or for some closure that didn't exist. And then, I did something I hadn't done in years. I started living again. That I reconnected with old friends, went out, had conversations that had nothing to do with my marriage, my ex, or the betrayal. I laughed again. Not the forced kind of laugh you use when you're trying to convince everyone you're fine. A real, genuine laugh. One night, while I was out with my friends, I noticed something: that I wasn't thinking about her anymore. She wasn't this looming presence in my mind, this weight dragging me down. I wasn't wondering what she was doing, if she missed me, if she regretted what she had done. Because it didn't matter. She had taken so much from me: my trust, my love, my time. But she didn't get to take my future. And in that moment, as I sat there, surrounded by people who actually cared about me, who never lied to me, who never made me feel like I wasn't enough, I realized something that changed everything. That I was happy, not because I had moved on completely. Not because everything was perfect. But because I was free. She had betrayed me. But I had won, because while she was stuck with the consequences of her actions, stuck with the kind of person who would sneak around with a married woman, I was moving forward, and I wasn't looking back. It had been a couple of weeks since I had walked away from Emily for good. And every day that passed, I felt lighter. The weight of her betrayal no longer clung to me the way it once had. The pain was still there, sure. But it no longer controlled me. It no longer dictated my thoughts, my actions, my emotions. I was in control now. The more distance I put between myself and that chapter of my life, the more I realized just how much of myself I had sacrificed for that relationship. For her. I had spent years compromising, making excuses, ignoring red flags, convincing myself that love meant sticking through the bad times no matter what. But what I had with Emily wasn't love. It was an illusion. A one-sided fantasy that only I had been committed to, and now, I was free. That freedom came with unexpected realizations that I started noticing how different I felt. I was sleeping better, eating better, working out again. I had energy that I hadn't felt in years. My mind wasn't constantly preoccupied with where she was, who she was talking to, what lies she was feeding me. I didn't have to walk on eggshells, afraid that any little thing might set her off, start an argument, or push her further away. That I was done being the man she had slowly tried to break. That I started filling my time with things that mattered. I poured myself into my work, not as a distraction, but because I actually enjoyed it again. I reconnected with family, with friends, with parts of myself that I had neglected for too long, and the best part, she wasn't in my head anymore. That I didn't care what she was doing. Whether she was still with that waiter or if she had already moved on to someone else. I wasn't checking her social media, I wasn't rereading old messages, I wasn't sitting there wondering what if, because there was no what if. She was the past. I was the future. One evening, I was sitting in my apartment, scrolling through my phone when an unknown number popped up. I knew before even opening it who it was, Emily. I stared at the message for a long moment, debating whether to even read it. But in the end, curiosity won out. I don't know if you'll even read this, but I just wanted to say that I'm sorry. I know I hurt you. I know I messed up. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I just needed you to know that I regret everything. I miss you. And I hate that this is how things ended. I read it twice, waiting for that familiar anger to rise in my chest. But it never came, because it didn't matter anymore. Maybe she was being sincere. Maybe it was just another manipulation, another way to test if she still had any control over me. But either way, I wasn't biting. That I didn't need closure. I didn't need an apology. That I had already moved on. That I deleted the message without replying, and as I sat there, staring at my phone, I smiled, because for the first time in a long time, I was truly free. A few days passed after Emily's message, and I never responded. I didn't need to. There was nothing left to say. I had already given her too much of my time, my emotions, my energy. Answering her, even to tell her off, would have been giving her exactly what she wanted, proof that she still had some kind of hold over me. But she didn't. She could live in regret. She could sit there, replaying everything she had done, trying to justify it, trying to convince herself that it wasn't all her fault. That she didn't throw away a marriage, that I played a role in it too. That's what people like her do. They rewrite history to make themselves feel better, to avoid taking full responsibility, but that wasn't my problem anymore. That I kept moving forward. That I started focusing on myself in a way that I hadn't in years. I got back into shape, started eating better, taking care of myself in ways I had neglected while I had been pouring every ounce of my energy into a marriage that had already been falling apart behind my back. That I traveled for the first time in years. Not far, just a solo weekend trip to a city I had always wanted to visit but never got around to because Emily had always had an excuse. She never liked when I did things without her. She had always found a way to make it seem like I was the bad guy for wanting time to myself. Now, I didn't need permission from anyone. The feeling of sitting in a new place, surrounded by strangers, knowing I didn't owe anyone an explanation for where I was or what I was doing. It was intoxicating. One night, while I was out, I met someone. Not in a dramatic, romantic way, not in some storybook, this is how I moved on, kind of way. Just a casual conversation, one that made me realize I was actually capable of talking to a woman without feeling the weight of my past dragging me down. She was a stranger, and I didn't even catch her name. But we talked for hours, laughed, exchanged stories about life, about work, about stupid things we had done when we were younger. And when I left, I wasn't thinking about Emily. I wasn't comparing. That I wasn't wondering if this woman would betray me the way Emily had, because for the first time, I wasn't afraid anymore. That I wasn't afraid of being alone. I wasn't afraid of the future. I wasn't afraid of starting over. The past would always be a part of me. What happened with Emily had shaped me, had changed me in ways I never expected. But it didn't define me. It didn't control me anymore. A few weeks later, I heard from a mutual friend that Emily and Nate had already fallen apart. Apparently, the excitement wore off, and she realized that sneaking around wasn't as fun when there was nothing to sneak around for. She had destroyed our marriage for something that barely lasted 2 months. The version of me from before would have been angry. Would have obsessed over it, wondering if she regretted everything, if she wished she had made a different choice, but I just laughed, because it didn't matter. She had already lost me, and I was finally free. The news that Emily and Nate had already fallen apart should have meant something to me. A few months ago, it would have. I would have obsessed over it, let it consume my thoughts, let it make me feel justified in my anger. But now? It barely registered because the truth was, I had already won. That I wasn't sitting around wondering what she was doing. I wasn't refreshing her social media, looking for clues, searching for signs of regret. I wasn't waking up every morning with that sick feeling in my stomach, thinking about her betrayal. I was past all of that, and that was something Emily would never understand. People like her don't move on in a healthy way. They don't take time to reflect, to learn, to grow. They jump from one situation to another, using people like stepping stones, never facing the damage they cause. And when it all comes crashing down, they panic. They try to go back to the last thing that felt safe, which is exactly why I wasn't surprised when, late one evening, she called me. I saw her name on my phone, and for a moment, I just stared at it. Months ago, I would have picked up immediately, heart racing, desperate for answers, desperate to hear something, anything that would make sense of what she had done, but I didn't feel that desperation anymore. I felt nothing. Still, curiosity got the best of me. So instead of ignoring it, I let it ring a few times, then picked up. Her voice was quiet, hesitant. Like she wasn't sure how to start. She wasn't crying, not yet. But I could hear the tension in her breath, the way she was already trying to gauge how much of my patience she had left. She started with small talk. Asking how I was, if I was okay. I let her talk, let her fumble through the meaningless pleasantries, and when she finally ran out of things to say, I stayed silent. And then came the real reason she called. She wanted to talk. To meet. She missed me. She had made mistakes. She had been confused. She had lost herself. She realized now what she had thrown away. She had been thinking about me a lot. It was pathetic. I listened to her, letting her unravel, letting her try to paint herself as this lost, broken person who had just made a few bad choices. She didn't want to talk about the affair itself, of course. She wanted to skip past that part, get to the part where she could cry about how lonely she was, how she didn't know what she wanted back then, how she had needed time to figure things out. I let her talk for a while. And then, finally, I spoke. I told her I wasn't angry. Not anymore. Because anger would mean I still cared, and I didn't. I told her I wasn't meeting up with her. That there was nothing to talk about. That whatever confusion she had felt, whatever mistakes she had made, they weren't my problem anymore. And the best part, she didn't expect that. She had called me hoping for some kind of opening. Hoping I would be weak. That I would hesitate. That she could play on my emotions, make me remember the good times, convince me that she was worth forgiving. She wasn't, and she never would be. I told her to lose my number. That I hoped she found whatever it was she was looking for, but it wasn't going to be me. And then I hung up. No dramatic last words. No drawn-out conversation, just silence. I sat there for a while, staring at my phone, waiting to feel something, anything, but all I felt was relief. For the first time in years, I was completely, truly free. After I hung up on Emily, I sat there for a long time, just staring at my phone, waiting for something to hit me. Regret, sadness, nostalgia, anything, but there was nothing. No part of me wanted to call her back. No part of me wanted to hear her voice again, to relive the past, to reopen wounds that had already healed. She was gone. And I had never been more certain that she was never meant to stay. For so long, I had let her betrayal define me. I had let it dictate my emotions, my thoughts, my sense of self-worth. I had let her break me. But now, sitting in my apartment, staring at my phone, I realized something. She didn't break me, she set me free. she had forced me to see things clearly, to step back and reevaluate my entire life. And in doing so, I had learned things I never would have learned if she had stayed faithful. I had learned how much I was willing to tolerate. How much of myself I had given up for someone who never deserved me, and most importantly, I had learned that I was so much better off without her. The next morning, I woke up to another text from her. Just one word. Please. I didn't reply that I didn't need to. Instead, I got up, went for a run, grabbed a coffee, and went about my day like a man who no longer carried the weight of a woman who had already lost everything, because that's what she was now, a loss, not mine, hers. She would live the rest of her life knowing that she had a man who loved her, who gave her everything, who was willing to build a life with her, and she threw it all away. And I would live the rest of my life knowing that I never had to look back, because my future was so much bigger than the past she had ruined.